welcome to the third and last day of EBAA's Virtual Safety Summit. I would like to begin by thanking our three main sponsors for supporting this event: Bombardier Aviation, Dassault Aviation, and Gulfstream. My name is Corina Shtibey, and I will be your host throughout today's sessions. And before we start, I would like to remind you that throughout the entire event, both the cameras and the microphones will be switched off by default. However, you have the option to raise your hand, and if the moderator decides that we have enough time and he allows it, you may be unmuted and ask your questions live. Otherwise, at the bottom of the screen next to the raise your hand button, you also have the Q&A tool. Please make sure to use it, submit your questions, and if we do not get to your question, or if you have a question anytime during the event or after the event, please write to us at safety@ebaa.org, and we will be more than happy to either answer your question or point you in the right direction. Now, the meeting will also be recorded video and audio, and the recordings will be made available through the EBAA website. To enhance the viewing of the slides that we're going to display today, please make sure to double click on the middle of the screen, and then you will have the slides in full screen. To exit this viewing, you can either click on the screen, double click again, or press the escape button on your keyboard. Now, as a recap of what we've discussed yesterday, we started the second day of the summit with an interview with Mr. Carlos Brana, Senior Executive Vice President at Dassault. During the first wave of the COVID crisis, the company's focus was on continuity, protecting people and maintaining manufacturing and deliveries as much as possible. In terms of customer support, the company had to juggle several new tasks while also maintaining contact with the customers. They had to develop and implement cleaning procedures. They had to look into modifications of the aircraft cargo capacities. They conducted filtering studies, and they also had to lobby to the authorities for deadline extensions for licenses, training, and medical certificates. Despite all these, the company achieved a quick win through medical flights in support of governmental and non-governmental initiatives. The OEM has seen the business aviation impacted by the travel restriction, but that was yet another opportunity for operators and manufacturers to show their resilience as companies. Since politicians, and not only, would not want a good crisis to go to waste, this time frame was auspicious for pushing the green agenda and promoting the use of sustainable aviation fuel. The discussion was concluded with the contributions that Dassault could bring to the safety, such as double heads-up displays and implementation of ROAS and landing distance at time of arrival to reduce runway excursions. We continued with a panel on part camo, gap analysis, and implementation plan. The panel was led by Kyle Martin, Vice President of European Affairs for the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, and he was joined by David van den Langenberg, the President of Aviation Services at Lux Aviation, Jeremy Neveu, airworthiness expert at EASA, and Paulo Pestana, Camo Regulatory Manager at NetJets. The session started with a presentation from Jeremy on the regulatory background and the context for SMS implementation into part camo. Paulo presented some of the questions that NetJets faced during the implementation of part camo within their own organization, and then the panel discussed based on these answers, on the questions and the answers offered by Jeremy. It was been agreed that the set of regulations improve the control that the organizations have over their vendors, and by connecting the safety management systems, the companies have more clarity and visibility, and it makes it easier to spot any potential safety issues with the vendors. And of course, that enables the companies to take actions in time. On the design and manufacturing side, there has been some time spent attempting to create standards for SMS. So would there be a benefit in developing SMS standards for camo? David van den Langenberg thinks standards are important, but our standard in Europe is EASA, so we need to stay close to their guidance material and acceptable means of compliance. We also need to reach out and communicate with them when we have issues. Of course, communicating with your national authority is also of utmost importance. But the key message here is that regardless of the authority you're communicating with, you need to keep all communication channels open and dare to go into conversation. You need to challenge the "you must do that" to make sure that whatever your company does is actually bringing value and it doesn't just keep somebody happy because you're ticking boxes on a checklist. After lunch, we came back with an interview with EASA. The speaker from EASA session, Mr. Luc Tidga, unfortunately had to cancel last minute. However, this was for the best reasons for the aviation industry. He had to attend the last meeting with the European Commission on the regime for aviation. However, his excellent stand-in, Mr. Jean-Marc Clouseau, who is a principal advisor to the executive director, an acting head of the strategy and program department, and an innovation manager, explained in the interview that not only operators need to be resilient, but also authorities. There were in-depth discussions about the work done by EASA and how they dealt with the COVID crisis. From return to normal operations work to the EASA ECDC Aviation Health and Safety Protocol. EASA had made contact with the operators during the crisis. The agency is very connected to both operators and associations. During these conversations, operators and associations were simply looking for a counterpart at European level whom they can discuss with and who can offer some advice and provide solutions. Mr. Clouseau concluded the interview by saying that the cooperation with EBAA is a model of cooperation that EASA would like to develop with all other associations. Lastly, the afternoon session was a panel session on past, present, and future regulatory challenges on peer support programs, alcohol and drugs testings. The panel was steered by Johan Glantz, EBA's Senior Safety and Regulatory Manager, and was joined by Adrian Becker, aviation psychologist and co-founder of the Center for Aviation Psychology, Dave Fielding, captain of A340 and an EPSI member, Julia Egerer, Aerodrome Sections Manager at EASA, and Jeroen Janssen, Senior Expert Air Operations at EASA. Julia provided a bit of background and context regarding the support programs initiated by EASA and reinforced the need for protecting confidentiality. Moreover, she underlined that EASA understands that business aviation operators, especially the smaller ones, will struggle and be burdened by a PSP implementation. The aim is to make outsourcing a viable option and to reassure the industry that EASA will not promote a one-size-fits-all solution. Lastly, Julia supported the idea of a step-by-step approach in building a program from scratch, even if that would take longer, because such a program would fit all the needs and specificities of a company rather than molding your company to fit into an off-the-shelf solution. Next, we heard from Dave, who presented EPSI, which stands for the European Pilot Peer Support Initiative, which was set up in 2016 in the aftermath of the German Wings accident, with the primary aim to define and promote best practices on peer support programs. He presented the peer support process launched by EPSI, which starts with an input, either a self-referral or family, friends, colleagues raising concerns. Following that, the core support process starts with gathering information, clarifications, and definition of the problem, and helping the pilot in finding one or more solutions. The output is the last step, and it means that a solution was found by one of the three methods. Either the pilot's issues were solved satisfactorily through just a conversation with peers, or signposting the pilot towards appropriate pathways to help him, or the pilot has received support via an intervention. The PSPs set up by the Center for Aviation Psychology are customized to each AOC's requirements and culture, covering over 20,000 pilots in more than 26 AOCs and speaking 8 languages over 11 countries. Acknowledging that there are many PSP providers out there, Adrian also provided advice on choosing the provider which is more fit for your company, such as do they comply with the GDPR, or what are the SOPs, how well trained are their peers. Jeroen gave us a brief presentation of the rules and specificities of alcohol testing during ramp inspections, and the testing is not done in a completely random manner, phrasing which has even been removed from the text of the regulation, but following a risk-based approach. I'm pleased to see that many of you joined us once again this morning for what promises to be another exciting day of discussing resilience and human factors. Now, I would like to thank once again our sponsor for today, Gulfstream, for supporting this event. And I would like to introduce Mr. Kurt Edwards, Director General of IBAC. Mr. Edwards has substantial experience in international aviation issues. Previous to coming to IBAC, he served in high-level capacities with the International Affairs and Environmental Office of the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. He also led the FAA's outreach efforts while based in Brussels and Paris, as well as at ICAO on environmental matters. Joining Mr. Edwards this morning will be EBAA COO, Mr. Robert Baltus, who will be moderating your questions. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
Good morning, it's Robert speaking. And there goes my... Oh.
Hi, good morning, Robert. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Kurt. And first of all, thank you for waking up at this this early time for you in beautiful Washington today.
I've got my tea. I'm good. Thank you.
Kurt, we're very pleased to have you here because we would like to give a more global approach to what's happening with the pandemic, but also how things are panning out for different organizations. So we thought it was excellent to have you here, and maybe if you briefly introduce what IBAC does and put up the slide that goes with it.
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me, and good morning, everyone. And I hope that I'm waking up as I'm speaking to you here today. So IBAC is basically the global representation of all the national and regional business aviation associations around the world, including, of course, EBAA. And just as EBAA and national associations work in Europe and national capitals there in Europe, IBAC exists to work mainly for you at the global level, the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal, where we have actually co-located our office in the ICAO headquarters buildings. So in dealing with, just as on the EBAA side, you're dealing with the various institutions of the European Union, as well as the capitals around Europe. For IBAC, what we are doing is we're working with the institutions of the International Civil Aviation Organization. And on the slide here, I've outlined several of them. The top one being the Assembly, which happens every 3 years, and that's the top political body that guides the work of ICAO. The work of ICAO that's taken place, and every 3 years they send the council off to do the work that they've asked for over those 3 years. So the council, permanent body, it's 36 representatives from 36 states, and it resides in Montreal year-round. So we work directly with them, and then they are advised by the highest technical body of ICAO called the Air Navigation Commission. Our director of our office in Montreal, Andy Meyer, he has a direct seat on the Air Navigation Commission as an observer among some of the other industry associations. He is also our official observer to the council when it meets. And then we have various representatives to technical panels that meet throughout the year. And I must say they are meeting more and more thanks to video conferencing and everyone discovering that. But we have key participation on the Committee for Aviation Environmental Protection. Many of you know Bruce Perry, who splits his time between IBAC and EBAA, and he's been a very able representative on CAPE. We have people that represent us on working groups on the North Atlantic. We have occasional folks who represent us in the Asia Pacific region at the Bangkok office. So that's where a lot of the real technical nitty-gritty work gets done. And then of course, there's a year-round permanent civil service at ICAO. It's the Secretariat, and they're the ones that are there to support the work of the Air Navigation Commission and advise the council. So we're also dealing with them directly. And then while doing all that within the ICAO structure, we're also promoting safety through our ISBAO and ISBA programs for operators and ground handlers. And we'll talk a little bit more about those later.
Well, thank you for that, Gert. I thought it was really useful for everybody to appreciate the whole ecosystem we're all working in. And just for people listening in, the EBAA has a lot of contacts with IBAC, and specifically through Bruce, but also with the SBAO and the ISBA. And we are a global industry, so with everything that's going on, it's actually more important to work in this global environment than anything else. But how was it for you? And let's go all the way back from the global, but zoom in on IBAC as an organization. How were you affected by the pandemic, and how did you manage to continue your operations?
I'd say we're probably facing the same challenges that most everyone in the industry has faced, whether it's your inability to travel and go out and meet with people, inability to hold in-person activities. There are budget issues. We're all facing extremely tight resources these days as spending goes down and people aren't able to spend. So those are kind of the big issues that have really made us re-examine how we work. So we're not traveling anymore, obviously. We've had to move what traditionally has always been in-person meetings through our workshops for ISBAO and ISBA online. That has actually gone fairly well. People have really received those opportunities in ways that we had not anticipated. So whereas we've tried to offer workshops at times that would be more appropriate for different regions around the world, we've actually found that it doesn't matter. We can offer a time for a workshop in North America. We'll still have folks from Europe or Asia in it, and vice versa. So, but we have found that the interest in the programs are still there, and having put them now online has been a real big help. We've also, with regard to supporting the participants within the programs, we've also developed the concept of remote audits. So we've had, I know that at least in the ISBAO world, we've had more than 60 audits, remote audits authorized since the end of April, or end of March, excuse me, and those are ongoing. I know that in ISBA we're doing the same thing. And that's helped both auditors and the participants, operators, and handlers in the programs. And then we've also been able to extend validity of registrations in order to basically accommodate these remote audits. So that's been good as well. The interesting thing about IBAC is that we're a virtual organization. We have the office in Montreal, obviously, but the rest of us are scattered around the world. So we have 5 people here in the United States. We have someone in Brazil. We have Stefan de Wolf, who I see is on, in Brussels, who assists us in Europe. And then we have 2 people in the United Kingdom. So we've already been working ourselves virtually. Now we're just kind of grounded and forced to see each other only via video screens.
Now, if you know a bit about my background, I used to be with an operator for most of my career, and our time span, our window we're looking at was roughly about, you know, tomorrow or a week out. That was like long-term planning. So when I went into the association world and got more involved on the regulation side and seeing the procedures on the European side, very well structured, but you know, it takes months, if not years, for certain things to change. ICAO is, even with all respect, almost a slower organization because they need to get the buy-in from all the different global players. So how easy was it to work from home when you work with an organization like ICAO? Did it actually, you know, did it get anything done? Or because you already alluded to that they actually starting to find out the ability to go for digital meetings. Has anything changed there?
Has anything changed? To a certain degree, yes, but in many ways, no. I am, however, pleasantly surprised with ICAO's resilience and its ability to continue operating through all of its bodies, whether it's the Council, the Secretariat's work, Air Navigation Commission, and even the panels. I think we all had this adjustment to going from traveling around the world for meetings, which was kind of the ICAO tradition, to doing this all online. And that has presented some unique challenges to ICAO world, as I call it, because official meetings at ICAO are done in the 6 official languages of the United Nations. And on video conferencing, that's hard to do, at least in the direction back to ICAO. So translators or the interpreters can interpret in one direction only, basically. So that's been a difficult thing to do, or for ICAO to handle. It has presented at times political issues, in that some states have insisted that they need to have, on certain issues, work conducted in all the languages. And that has slowed down some of the deliberations in the council, but those tend to be more at political levels than they are technical levels in terms of getting things done. Robert, you're right. It takes, they say, on average 5 years to develop a new standard or an amended standard at ICAO, from the beginning when it's proposed at a working level all the way up through the Air Navigation Commission adopting it and recommending it to the council. So it can be a long process. That said, I'd say that with regard to my pleasantly being surprised at how they've worked, they really jumped in and worked quickly to develop what was called the Council Aviation Recovery Task Force report, the CART report. And the first version of that came out in end of May, early June, with kind of broad guidelines for states to take into account in terms of helping industry to continue to operate and actually renew operations or start them again to the best of their abilities. And then ICAO has also joined with the World Health Organization to engage a working group called CAPSCA, and it has a very long name that gets you to the CAP-SCA abbreviation, but it's basically a collaborative activity between public health authorities and civil aviation authorities on issues related to public health and safety. So IBAC is on that as well, and we've been working with them. They meet at least 3 times a week, trying to hash out technical issues that relate to public health and the safe operations of their transport system. And there have been, as you might imagine, some pretty delicate conversations there.
Well, it definitely shows that we need a global response to things, and I think ICAO is well placed to do so and work on that. But let's turn it around, because you already say, okay, these are the things they're working on. But have you also felt from or did you get feedback from operators, from a global operator perspective? What were the first things they were asking for from ICAO through their associations or through IBAC or your affiliate or other associations for airlines? You know what the first ask was for the airlines?
Well, I'd say that our industry, or our sector of the industry, and the airlines kind of shared a couple of key interests. And those were guidance. What do we do? And the second broad request, which might have been a little bit more specific, was how are we going to handle currency requirements? There needs to be some alleviation of training requirements, currency requirements, anything that was time limited that could not be supported via training or regular operations in a shorter period of time, given that we basically weren't operating. So I think those were the 2 kind of big areas that ICAO was being asked to look at by our sector, as well as the airlines. Now, more specific to our sector, we had a very interesting request coming out of the Asia Pacific region, which was, as we were shutting down the air transport system mid-March, end of March, they're facing typhoon and cyclone season over there. And they had grounded aircraft in a number of places that they felt they could be in harm's way with regard to incoming storms. So already by the end of March, early April, there was a concept called the Public Health Corridor, which was allowing freer movement of cargo aircraft, very focused on procedures for handling cargo crew, getting them into airports, into their hotels for overnights, and then back to the airports and into their aircraft with as little exposure as possible, and allowing for those important flights that were bringing the protective equipment, medical equipment around the world. With our aircraft in harm's way, potentially in Asia, the Asian Association asked if there was a way that we could move to help them get to those aircraft and get them out of those places that might be affected by bad weather, really bad weather that would damage the aircraft. So we were able to bring this concern to the CAPSCA group, which agreed with us that this was absolutely necessary, and there were going to be other sectors of the industry also facing the same thing, and we were able to work that into the public health corridor concept. We also took the opportunity to work with the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, GAMA, to see if there were any particular types of aircraft deliveries that they really wanted to be included in this public health corridor concept as well. And there were a number of deliveries to public sector entities for aircraft that were planned to be used for public sector medical support, evacuations, surveillance, whatever. We were able to get those included as well. So it was kind of a broad way of getting our sector, especially the most needy kind of operations, able to take place as early as possible.
Okay. And the last question I wanted to pose to you is, safety is part of our industry's DNA. And I think through the link with IBAC or with the ISBA and ISBAA, you got a good feel of what's happening in the market, etc. So what are, in your view, the three biggest risks that operators need to think about in this constantly evolving environment we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that people are very focused on right now is what do we have to do differently to make sure that our personnel and our passengers are safe and that we're not transmitting the virus. So that's kind of the biggest thing out there. But then you have kind of these two additional things where we're not operating as much, so we may not be practicing as much. We may not be kind of thinking of on a regular basis like we used to. What are the hazards we have to mitigate? And I think that between the preoccupation with the virus and perhaps not operating as much and maintaining that currency, that kind of always thinking of those things, I think those are the things we need to remind ourselves of, that it's important. These hazards don't go away. These risks don't go away, even though we're operating less. How do we make sure that we are staying on top of them? We're not being complacent, or we're just not forgetting to think about those things due to lack of activity.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for waking up so early, Kurt. It's much appreciated. IBAC and EBAA go back a long time, and it's very important that, like we said, it's a global industry. Within Europe and with EASA, we're fully supporting what EASA is trying to do in standardizing everything in Europe. But with our industry, it needs to be global. So thank you very much for giving some insights from your side. And I wish you an excellent day. And I think we owe you some coffees for waking up this early. So with that, back to Karina.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, EBAA.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Now we are going to move to our first panel for today. Robert will stay on as the moderator of this panel, and I would like to introduce his fellow panelists today. We are going to have with us Mr. Eduard Ciofu, Head of Air Operations Department at EASA, Mr. Stan Medved, Director Corporate Aviation and Chief Pilot at Shell Aircraft Limited, and Mr. Bennett Walsh, ISBAA Program Director at IBAC. Mr. Ciofu graduated from the Polytechnic University of Bucharest as an aeronautical engineer and started his career in the Romanian CAA in Bucharest, where he dealt with various topics such as environmental protection, internal audit, and operator certification. In 2006, Eduard joined EASA, where he was in charge of coordination of the EU SAFA program. Since 2015, he has been managing the Air Operations Standards section, where he is responsible for drafting requirements, addressing the entire spectrum of air operations. He's managing the project RNO, Return to Normal Operations, a project launched by EASA to support the European member states and industry to cope and recover swiftly and safely from the COVID-19 crisis. In July 2020, he was appointed as head of the Air Operations Department that is responsible for rulemaking and standardization in the field of air operations and aerodromes, SAFA program, TCO, and also for the oversight of EU operators for which the EASA is acting as a competent authority. Stan began his career in the Royal Australian Air Force as an engineer and engineering officer and pilot. He served in several engineering and flying roles, including line pilot, instructor, and maintenance test pilot duties on the C-130 Hercules. He has a degree in aeronautical engineering and a master's of business administration, and he also holds fixed wing and helicopter professional pilot licenses. He's currently flying the Dassault Falcon 8X with Shell, and Stan is also a fellow of the Royal Aeronautical Society. He's the chair of the EBAA Safety Committee, chair of the IBAA Standards Board, and a board member of the British Business and General Aviation Association. Bennett Walsh is a third-generation aviator with 3 decades of aviation experience, holding an airline transfer pilot certificate, and type ratings in 6 different aircraft. He has a bachelor degree in aviation resource management, and he's been the EBAA program director since the fall of 2016. He has served other esteemed organizations in such capacities, including Senior Vice President of Operations, Director of Safety, Internal Auditor, Simulator Instructor, Check Airman, and Proficiency Check Pilot. Additionally, he audited aviation management and safety systems while conducting both business aviation EBAA audits and airlines IOSA audits worldwide. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Corina, for that introduction, and welcome to all 3 panelists. And we're very happy to have you here. And what I like about the panel is that we have 3 different kind of panelists here. We have an operator, we have a regulator, and we have somebody for an industry standard program who looks after a lot of operators, but at the same time, obviously, has a close link with the work of the regulators. So the panel is all about what new ways of working do we want to keep after the crisis has ended. But let me just start with opening the floor by asking all 3 of you a simple question, which is, how has the current situation affected your organization? And I would like to start with Stan. How did the current situation, the whole COVID thing, affect your organization, and what happened?
Oh, good morning. Thanks, Robert. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I've got to say, when COVID first struck, we were pretty much shell-shocked, and pardon the pun. Really, at the end of March, our flying just suddenly stopped. We just had a wave of cancellations, and really, people were stunned initially. And we spoke at the conference here about resilience, and that's where we saw resilience really kick in the first few days, first weeks. And when we sort of looked at, well, what are we going to do if we're not going to be flying? How are we going to manage currency? How are we going to manage the welfare and well-being of our people? Now, people were concerned about their jobs and their futures because the whole world around them was pretty much collapsing. But after that initial shock, we identified certainly new ways of working, and certainly within our own organisation, we found a whole lot of demand that couldn't be satisfied by the airlines. And we went from a cliff edge of no flying at all and looking at a very bleak future to a period now where we're really pushing the limits of our capacity, where we're flying more than we did last year, a different type of flying, and with lots of challenges around COVID. So a lot of changes in the organisation, and it's where resilience actually showed through.
And Eduard, if we pose the same question to you, if you look at your organization and what happened, if you can give a quick recap on that.
Hi, good morning, Robert. Thanks for having me here in your meeting. I hope everyone is all right around the call and around the world joining this this event. EASA, of course, was not immune to the crisis, and it did affect us as well. Of course, we are not an operator, so we had to deal with it in a different way, in the sense that the agency, it's a quite mobile organization, in the sense that we have to travel to do our business, we have to audit organizations in Europe or around the world. And this was one of the first impacts that we started to feel, and then this accelerated certain processes that were somehow on the shelf, that we had to all of a sudden deploy in practice without, let's say, the usual fairly lengthy and thorough change management process that otherwise would have been instituted. I heard Kurt speaking about remote audits. We were not any different in that sense. We had to continue providing the service, even that we could not move and fly where we should have been in terms of performing our audits. And this was one of the let's say, the most relevant and big impacts in terms of adjusting from this international footprint organization to work remotely for most of our activities. At the same time, I think this is also worth noting, the agency never closed. We managed to remain, let's say, with the building open, and colleagues were able to access our location coming from Germany or elsewhere, in order to be here and respond to the crisis by building our own crisis management. I think it's important perhaps to spend a moment and think of this crisis, which is a big crisis at the level of the entire society, and by far the biggest crisis when it comes to aviation. And of course, I think it's natural to think that a crisis of this magnitude will fundamentally reshape the world and will fundamentally reshape aviation. Well, in my opinion, I'm not so sure about that. My take is that this crisis ultimately will not change much, but will accelerate everything. And we felt this in a way the EASA was working by adjusting to this new world of working, to the new normal, fast, and okay, there was some syncops in that, but ultimately we were still here ready to deliver the service that we do.
I wanted to pose the same question to Ben, but we lost Ben, so that's the new working. But since we're a very resilient organization, I'm going to come back to you, Stan, and I would like to ask a follow-up question. So, what was a quick win that your company was able to make, and what do you think might be useful also for other companies? Because with a lot of changes in the organization, was there anything that stood out to you that you thought like, wow, this was different than we had anticipated? Or
well, there are a number of things that were different, but really taking advantage of digitalization, really moving away from the face-to-face elements in terms of auditing, for example, and interactions with our regulators. We found that they were willing to embrace digitalization. So rather than relying on physical signed copies of things like CFA, Certificate of Airworthiness, and so on, it was all digitized. And that really, actually, it's a great way of working. I'd want to keep that afterwards.
That's an interesting one, because that is something which came in one of the previous sessions as well, that the signing and the physical paperwork, this might be the final push for a time going forward, that we want less and less physical paperwork and even with the remote audits as well. And you say you're not so sure that the industry will change that much, Eduard. Do you still think that this will be one of the things that will be taken on board more if you look forward?
Yeah, don't get me wrong. The industry will change. The whole society will change. I would say it will not change fundamentally. It will not be a fundamental reshape of the way aviation functions. And certainly, digitalization will be one of those areas that will be tremendously accelerated. I can recognize one-to-one what Stan was mentioning that happened in EASA as well. We are, at the end of the day, an administration, a lot of checks of balances here, a lot of signatures before anything is moving ahead. This necessity is a mother of invention, as they say, and we had a practical example in this case where ideas and projects that otherwise would have taken some time to be deployed, and perhaps with additional organic growth built into those processes, even digital, those were tremendously accelerated by this crisis. So embracing indeed the digital world was one of the biggest gains that we have. And this is not just a change in the way we do business because of necessity, but also led to a change in the mentality within colleagues and the staff of EASA. For example, we are now putting a lot more emphasis in looking at our rules in terms of whether they are facilitating digitalization of the industry, whether there are any obstacles that are built in our rules that have been constantly carried over from 1944 when we had the convention. I think Stan mentioned the certificates and the signature. We still have names like this in our rules. What do they mean in 21st century? What do they mean in a digital world? And it's a process that we have started, and it's pushed with quite high priority within our agency, and especially in my directorate, to modernize our rules, to avoid this rather arcane provisions become an obstacle to digitalize the industry.
But if we follow up on that, Eduard, do you, because I mentioned it yesterday in another session already, I'm amazed with the amount of work you've been able to do in this time, because let's face it, we have the 737 MAX issue. We have something called Brexit, which technically is 20 working days away from where we are now. And then we have this COVID. Where do you find the bandwidth to work on that? Because I think it's excellent. The tools are there. And I think you're spot on, where we've been doing a lot of things since 1940 something. And this is the moment, because it's almost like a perfect storm. We are pushed to change. The technical tools are there. But then we need to update those regulations. Do you have the bandwidth for that at the moment, or do you see that as a process for the next 2-3 years to clean it up?
Yeah, the perfect time is never, and the perfect time for a crisis is even worse than that. Yeah. And indeed, the lines of the holes have aligned this time with the three big examples that you gave. But at the same time, those had to be dealt with. We could not afford to ignore them. They would not go away by themselves. So we had to change, and we had to change on the fly. Basically, that's why this project RNO that you have been mentioned was put together. It was really a crisis solution to a really crisis situation. We put the fire brigade together, recognizing that our processes have been designed to work in a world of high regularity, which was aviation pre-COVID, and recognizing that all the carefully manicured and very detailed regulatory systems that we have in place are tested to the extremes. So we need to be ready to tackle all this to tackle with the situation in front of us, because the world or the reality doesn't change to fit the rules. It's the other way around. The rules have to change to fit the reality. So of course we had to move some resources from certain processes that we have, of course within the constraints of the overall resources available in the agency. And for example, one reservoir of resources that we tapped in was the resources allocated to standardization, where we work with the member states by monitoring what they are doing and how they are implementing the member states. There we had to repurpose that reservoir of resources and use them more of a help desk function to help the member states, to help the industry, to help during this, let's say, acute phase of the crisis, to produce all this guidance that we felt it was necessary during those days. And of course, we also had to prepare for the post-acute. You see that we are all now using a lot of these medical terms due to the exposure to this medical jargon. So we also had to prepare to recover. Of course, we all have hope that this will be a V-shaped recovery. So by the end of this year, we will be back to 80–90% of where we were back in the day. It's clearly not the same, but certainly it's, while again will not be a fundamental change, it will also not be how we left it. So this requires us to reprioritize. And I can speak, for example, in terms of our rulemaking activities there, and you have seen that the plans for the next years have been reshaped with two agendas in mind. One is looking at the ability of the industry to sustain the regulatory effort. We do rules by working with the industry. It's not that EASA sits here in Cologne and drafts all these rules by itself. We are always engaging with the member states and with the industry. We tap into this knowledge base out there. And at the moment when the industry is fighting for its survival, we know that they will not be able to support that effort. So that was one of the elements that we considered in reshaping our plans, and also giving priority to those rules that will help with the recovery, that will bring this flexibility, that will bring this modernization in our rules, that will make, let's say, will provide for an environment for the industry to recover swiftly. And there's a number of them that I think will come soon. Evidence-based training, modernizing the rules when it comes to fuel management, all-weather operation, which I think is particularly relevant for the world of general aviation, by allowing modern and quite good technology to give more access to more runways around the world in low visibility conditions.
Thank you for that, Eduard. Just going back to Stan, unfortunately we still have lost Ben, and so either he has gone back to bed, he is on the West Coast in the US, or it is a technology gremlin. But so I'll go back to Stan, and you already mentioned something earlier on, and it's a question I actually would like to ask both of you, but from a different angle, because you're looking at them from a different angle. So how receptive were the authorities? Did you feel like they were leading or lagging, trendsetters or late adapters? And this is to you, Stan, and obviously if your regulator is listening, but compliments are welcome. But how did you see the regulator in your particular case deal with the issues you were facing?
Well, I think it was a bit of a mixed response. It started off again a little bit stunned. I think it caught everyone a little bit by surprise by how quickly everything came to a grinding halt. But that said, I've got to say we found our relationship with and response of the regulator to be very positive and willing to look at different ways of working, looking at how to change. And I've already explained the increasing digitization, finding ways to achieve the same outcome but following a slightly different path. which is good because I mean that's what we've been trying to do, and I think most operators have been trying to work out how can we operate efficiently, safely, how can we stay in business, and how can we get the support from the regulator. And so through this partnership and through the support of the regulator, we've found that we've been able to continue operations and do it safely, and not just manage the risks that we face routinely, but the whole new COVID risk as well, from a health perspective, but also through all the interruptions and barriers at operating under COVID rules and travelling to different countries, for example, different public health requirements, different aviation requirements, national requirements. So working in partnership with the regulator has really helped us get through this time. So I've got to say, overall, I've found the support from our regulators to be very positive. And I'd like to encourage the regulators to keep that as we move out of this crisis, to keep that engagement and openness to adapt and change.
Yeah, just because for the listeners and viewers' information, the structure of your aircraft, you operate to EASA standard, but on VP registered aircraft, or can you?
Yeah, we're a Bermuda registered aircraft, but we operate a Part 145 organisation under EASA. We're also a CAMO organisation, Part NCC. So we've got quite a hybrid range of regulators. And in fact, right now we're being audited by the Dutch CAA on our 145 organisation. So I'll be going and joining them shortly.
Okay, because that was my follow-on question actually to understand your structure is, did you have any audits in what's happened for you, and have you been audited in the last few months, and how did that work?
We've had some audits. We have had some face-to-face audits, but done through a socially distanced sort of abbreviated form with a lot of pre-work done by reviewing of documents and processes online. We've also had reviews done completely remotely by just reviewing documentation and interviews using Zoom or similar tools.
Yep.
And then using digitalization for documentation and certification. So it's been a hybrid approach.
Okay, so going back to the initial question I posed before, and I would like to pose them to Eduard. For you, if we look at the customers you have, or the people you deal with, you obviously have the operators are the final customers, but for you, there's an intermediate layer. It's the national authorities you also have to work with. From how receptive were they, and is there a big difference in how they dealt with things? Because I like the term earlier used by Stan, shell-shocked. I assume that all the different authorities, the NAAs, what we tend to see is that they are already, a lot of them are resource, there's not sufficient resources, so they already are facing some issues there. If something like this happens, I can assume that there's a complete different way they've dealt with it. Can you give us a general flavor of how you see or saw them change or adapt or not?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you, Stan, for giving us the, let's say, the view coming from the industry side. I think we were, like perhaps the whole world, in denial for a little while, that this will not come to us, that it will not come to Europe, this pandemic, that will come and go quickly. But then we realized, I think, come February, that this will not be the case. And we started to get prepared and started rolling out the first SIBs on that. But again, hoping that this will affect us rather lightly. But then, of course, we realized that this might not be the case. We saw Europe kind of imploding in Europe in early days, March and April, with all these lockdowns and national measures having instituted. We kind of anticipated that we need to be ahead of that problem. Knowing that aviation is an intrinsically international business, and aviation needs harmonization, needs commonality of standard. And this is recognized. That's why we have such strong European bodies, international bodies. ICAO is very strong. EASA, we believe, is a strong European regulator. But of course, we have our complex system of member states. And of course, the diversity is the strength of Europe. At times, is also a challenge to navigate through this diversity. And for us, we had taken this as the top of the agenda to make sure that when it comes to aviation, we have this harmonization to the highest level that we can master. I must say the response coming from the member states was also quite good, because they also resonated to this need. No one felt that they need to tackle this in their own way, in isolation. I think everyone understands this international nature of our business and the need to rally together. So the cooperation with our member states was excellent. The fact that we have had already before the crisis quite robust networks of stakeholders, being industry and member states, also helped us tremendously, because at the click of a mouse button, we can reach out all the member states, we can reach out all the industry associations, and the reaction from the member states was quite positive. We maintain it very much so, very close lines of communication. And as I mentioned, we kind of change our approach from let's say someone that is checking whether they are doing what they're supposed to be doing, to a partner in helping all the member states to let's say be there for their industry, still with the regulator hat on, but very much in tune with the needs of the industry during these difficult times.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to see we've been able to get Ben back online. Ben, good morning. And we went through some questions already, Ben, and there's one thing which is a fairly wide question I would like to ask you, is that we're talking about what happened. So what happened to the organization and how did you adapt and going forward? And there's something I would like to ask you with your SBO hat on. For the viewers who are not aware of SBO, you should try to find out as soon as possible. SBO is the industry standard by industry for industry. It's the non-profit industry standard, whereby we want to ensure that business aviation retains the highest level of operation and the most practical one. So quick sales pitch, but please do reach out for SBO, because through IBAC, which you heard before, EBAA is also participating and supporting SBO where we can. So Ben, the question to you, how did the whole crisis affect you? And more important, and that's the follow-up question with that, how have you been able to reach out and still do audits, which is part of the standard, with the different operators? Could you enlighten us, please?
Well, certainly. My apologies for the connectivity issues. I switched to my mobile and it seems to be working. So thank you for this distinct privilege to be here amongst all of you. As many of the panelists already mentioned, we definitely were in a wait and see at the beginning. We all thought this was going to be over quickly. Of course, it wasn't. The SBAO standard being the integrated management system that is a performance-based management system standard, if you will, for SMS, for other types of risk reduction throughout the organization, is something that the operator does to go above and beyond. So there is a large motivation amongst operators to continue to have that accreditation, to be able to be registered for various purposes. Some nation states use it for their operating certificate, others for insurance purposes and rate reduction, others for competitive reasons, and others, of course, for the principle of the matter. So once we realized within that first month of March that this was going to be a long-term issue, we've done many things, like most of you, that we've never done before. But the operators deserved it because we are an operator standard, as you mentioned, for the operators, and we're governed by the operators. And thank you to Stan, who is our current chairman of the standards board. So one of the first things we had to do was grant extensions. Many operators were dealing with shutdown, lack of or reduced operations. So we granted many extensions immediately to those coming due on their registration. We also developed a policy quickly for remote auditing. I think we were the first NGO to have remote auditing beginning in mid-March of 2020 with special guidance and rules to assist the industry to do so. We built upon it with the initial first opportunities as operators did it to share with the industry on how that would work, something that we hadn't done before. It's worked fairly well, actually. We've had well over almost 60 now that we've completed. We have about 76 approvals to date. Believe it or not, we've still had live audits continue from in various parts of the world, in various places with precaution, obviously. So with a little bit of a lag there through March and April, it's picked up and the numbers are pretty much back to normal. So implementing, using technology and assisting the operators specifically was how it affected us. We had to get on the ball quickly in order to do that.
All right, thank you very much. Then, one of the things we've seen quite a bit when the pandemic started, and something that has changed quite a bit is training. There's certain restrictions to training. We all would like to have, even before the pandemic, simulators always tend to be in the wrong place, always hard to get to, and never available, and also too expensive. I think that's roughly the order that we rate the simulators. But at the same time, they're one of the most efficient and useful tools to use. So if we look at this from a training perspective, I would like to start with you, Stan. What things did you run into? And more important, also, what did you do to mitigate it? Or how have you changed the way you're training?
Now, we anticipated that training would be difficult or challenging because we typically train in the UK with the simulators over there. So we initially said, well, if we're not going to be flying very much, we got approval internally to conduct training flights in the aircraft just to maintain some currency and some basic levels of proficiency. And we also increased our ground training. So really looked at what online training we could do just to keep people in that mindset and keep them, I guess, professionally motivated and current. As it turned out, we found that we were able to maintain access to the simulators in the UK through the UK CAA's initiatives, and also with the government departments there putting together a safe travel corridor for aircrew. So we could actually, most of our crews did their summer training when the UK was in complete lockdown. So we were still able to go there. But we weren't quite able to do everything we wanted to do in the simulator. For example, we bring our flight attendants to do at least one session with the flight attendants in the simulator. But because of social distancing and limitation on people in the actual simulator itself, we couldn't complete that part of the training. But pretty much for the rest, we could work with the provider to come up and still comply with all the social distancing requirements and additional procedures. For example, we couldn't use headsets inside the simulator, but we could work around that. And in the end, I think we had a very successful summer training program, and now we've launched into our winter training program in pretty much the same way. But I also acknowledge if you had to travel, for operators that might be in other locations, say in the Far East, for example, where they can't get across to Europe easily, then I can really see the issues, significant issues in that. Australian crews, for example, where it's almost impossible to travel to or from Australia at the moment. So we've been very fortunate, but I acknowledge that some operators have had great difficulty.
I think the only really positive story I heard was somebody who was changing his full fleet and was able to do all the training they had planned over 6 months in 1 month, because all the crews were grounded, but they had access to a simulator. But that's the only positive story I heard on that. So, Eduard, if we pose that same to you, what was the feedback you got on training? What was needed, and what people were missing, and what has EASA done? Because we've seen some very good initiatives very early on already on the currency, etc.
Yeah, when it comes to training, I think this was one of the very first focus areas we had. I think next to the one addressing the mitigation of the epidemiological risk, the other bit was indeed addressing the training and checking of pilots' access to training. We have, as I said, very meticulous and very detailed regulatory systems with expiry dates and so on. Of course, they are designed to work in a 24/7 environment that aviation was pre-pandemic. At the same time, we also had to accept and to recognize that a certificate holder is not competent today and then not competent the next day, because the expiration date on a license, on a certificate, on a prof check says so. So there is, let's say, there's safety margins built in our licensing and training systems. And this is one of the areas that we really tapped into at the beginning by allowing it's a continuation of service by directing, hopefully in a harmonized manner, the member states in the use of flexibility provisions on how to handle the situation, to avoid having pilots and cabin crew and mechanics not being able to exercise their privileges due to the developing situation in terms of access to the training facilities. Of course, we all hope that in 8 months this will be done. The cruel reality is telling us that perhaps might not be the case. At the same time, there's also evolution in terms of access to training facilities. The lockdowns have a bit more permeability these days. There are still cases where there's a single location, and that location is perhaps in the wrong place for many. Today, we will be publishing revised guidelines addressing indeed the use of exemptions to in the context of licensing, training, and checking. So you can follow on our website and social media when the announcement is published. At the same time, we also, again, has prompted us to look at our systems. And of course, we are looking at the most effective training. Simulators are indeed a very good tool for that. But are simulators to be used every time? Especially looking at the advent of new technology. And I think one that shows a lot of promises is virtual reality. You perhaps have seen that we have put out a while back, not that long back, some guidance on the use of virtual reality for cabin crew training. Here we see a lot of potential in the future of using novel technologies for training, virtual reality being one of them. An example, aerodrome qualification or the observation of Cat 3 approaches. You don't have to see in the cockpit to do this. I think virtual reality could lend itself very well for this type of training. So this is an area that will be, let's say, a focus areas for future modernization in terms of our regulatory systems, in terms of allowing training to be as effective and efficient, perhaps at a fraction of the cost, not putting the staff in simulators every time for every type of training. And at the same time, also moving in areas where training is traditionally classroom training. When you look at mechanics training, normally there's an instructor in front of a classroom going through some diagrams and so on. There's perhaps some videos. There's a huge potential in using this immersive technology to actually make training even better, and as I said, not at the cost that perhaps we have or the industry has to to pay for all type of training. It will not replace the need of simulators. I think there's still a great deal of training that will require the fidelity and the ability to replicate the aircraft that a simulator will provide. But certainly we see areas where we can embrace other technology in the context of training.
Yeah, I think I fully concur with that, Eduard. And I think it's almost like a perfect storm we're in, because the technical capabilities have been coming at us, but almost like the previous remark, we're still training like it's 1942, 1945 kind of thing. My son has the latest version of the Microsoft simulator, and the visuals on it are better than on the simulator I train in. So it's you see that things are moving down market. But at the same time, we also seen, I thought, really interesting initiatives that some of the operators are doing touch drills in the actual aircraft. So they couldn't go to the simulator, so some of the things just to keep them current. So I think people are creative, and these are things I think we should try to embrace and hold on to. The same question to you, Ben. If you look at the operators you're looking after, and the nice thing I think with you is that you have a much wider scope because you look globally at this. Do you see the same issues in other countries, and how are people there dealing with training?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There is two parts to that. One, strategic support, and then two, the tactical of what the operators have actually done. First thing, strategically, from the EBAA side, training has evolved certainly in this space to the online workshops that we do for the safety officer training, for the recurrent and initial training for operators and auditors alike. And that's been well received. Obviously, it's an obvious win, and it's saves everybody time and trouble and money and hassle during this current situation. Using and leveraging the operators in the program, 700 globally, the round test of stage 3 operator group. So for those of you who don't know, this EBAA goes through a maturation process of the safety culture. So there's various stages. Developed several organic roundtables to share best practice amongst our community. The business aviation, you know, it's a challenging environment. You're dealing in the normal times, the most unique situations, airports, special needs, services, etc. So what you do every day and do so well is commendable. Now throw COVID and all those changes that we've all gotten used to now into the mix, and you're not as proficient. Nobody's flying enough. It's been a risk situation that we had to mitigate. So a couple of things came out of that, and it's very interesting to walk through when we have the roundtables. It's recorded for those that want to see it or hear it. But some of the operators were discussing and sharing their checklists, just basic things. I'll give you an example. So basically, the answer to the question is organic collaboration, and that's how we support our operators, and specifically in the progressive stage through that leadership team. But it's open to all of the operators there. But imagine pulling up at a ramp. You think you've done everything, prepared your flight appropriately, or you're getting ready to go, and you have the rental cars, and okay, we can't go through the terminal, let's leave the cars on the ramp. You pull up, you get in the airplane, you close the door, you're ready to go, and the car's still sitting there. And then you realize, oh, when you talk to the FBO, ground service personnel, no, we can't touch the car until it's clean. You have to clean it. So what do you do? So these kind of things are real life stories. And so in essence, a really good takeaway was applying the risk reduction through many of these principles from our safety systems and our culture, especially with management of change, to a much more tactical level. In essence, when you think and prepare in your mind for a flight, you're thinking in the phases of flights. I got to get my clearance. We're going to do our engine starts. We're going to get, the taxi route. We got to brief an RNAV departure, en route climb, that sort of thing, fuel arrival approaches. But really now the phase of flight is home to hotel. And you've always thought through that, obviously, because you have a lot of preparation, but these human touch points have changed. So applying a change management model is what they did to those human touch points from the home to the hotel for the crew and for the principals, et cetera. So it's just pushing us in different ways to apply the skills and the tools that we have currently. And then already mentioned was the touch drills, use leveraging engine runs and taxi drills, and even special training flights, et cetera, or simulators. So the industry's been very proactive.
Very good. Well, we are talking about the fun stuff, the simulators, the pilots, etc. But before the pandemic started, I think the biggest crisis that was looming was engineers, for various reasons. I think, first of all, I think the certification of engineers has always been a pain because it's too much focused on an aircraft type rather than on the skills and the specific avionics sets or engines on an aircraft, etc., for which you tend not to get credit. So engineers have been overlooked, but actually it's the biggest crisis if the industry picks up again, awaiting business aviation. But they also, I think we run into two things with engineers. One is how do you get an engineer to a difficult location if he needs to sign something off? And the second thing is training of engineers. What are your views on that, Stan?
Well, we've run into that issue of trying to get an engineer into a location where an aircraft was AOG, and it really was challenging, and it required a lot of different approvals to make that happen. And that's where we're facing this difference, or the conflicts between what the aviation regulators require and then what the public health authorities require, and the two don't necessarily see eye to eye. And really, from that perspective, we would have liked to have seen better coordination between those different groups. But for engineers, I mean, we've spoken about simulators and access to simulators, but for us, we've found that we've had to defer quite a lot of engineering training because of the public health requirements, where face-to-face classroom activity couldn't be done, and the online offerings weren't really mature enough to replace them. And we've all done online training modules, and it's death by PowerPoint. And really, I question some of the value in those trainings. I recognise what Eduard had said, but I really support modern online training. I mean, if you see how successful this summit has been using the interactive tools here, I mean, in a face-to-face environment, a lot of the learning comes from the discussion and having the different engineers together who can relate experiences, which you don't get by just doing a PowerPoint training module. But using well-established tools such as the one we're using today, you can get that interaction and I think you could actually improve the quality of the training. You can get better standardization from it, and certainly cut down cost and cut down time, because it is a big ask to send people away somewhere, travel time away, and they're not available to work on the aircraft, which we need the engineers, but we do have a shortage of engineers in the industry, and having them competent.
And you, in essence, with your operation, you're in a luxurious position because you have a common time in the fleet. Okay, you've got the latest version and the 8X and before the 7X. But I can imagine if you're an operator with 40 aircraft and there's 20 different aircraft types in there, it must be a pain.
No, and I think the online training, well structured, will help immensely.
Just going back, and this is a general interest question more than anything else, is for the flight preparation before COVID and now, how big a difference is there? Because you already mentioned the different health requirements with each state. So how much more time is now spent on preparing a flight, if you have a benchmark versus before the pandemic?
In terms of time, it's difficult to put a number on it, but I'd like to echo Ben's comment. A lot of the pre-trip, the part from home to the airport was a given. I mean, there's always been risk around that, depending on location, and we would put a lot of effort in high-risk locations if there were safety or security risks in locations. But now every flight we do requires a lot more preparation, and because of the COVID restrictions, public health requirements, and so on. And if you fly from one location this week, if you fly there again in a month's time, the requirements could have changed. So you can't rely on what you did before. So I mean, I think the hardest work group in our organisation is our operations team, where they've been doing so much preparation, so much additional work for what used to be routine. So in a lot of cases, the workload is doubled for them.
It's an interesting thing because we also get feedback specifically from charter operators, is that the people are booking later because obviously they only want to go if they need to go. So, but then the workload is much harder. So you would like to have them book earlier, so at least you could prepare it better. So it's a difficult one to keep together. Just a quick one for you on that as well, then, Eduard, on the engineers training. You already mentioned it. Are there any particular things that pop to your mind? Because I know there have been discussions in the past on engineers training and certification, etc. Is there anything in the pipeline on that?
Here is a bit outside of my area of immediate competence. Certainly they need to involve as well. So there's no single category of personnel that when it comes to their training that should not move in terms of the philosophy we have. When it comes, and I will make a parallel with the pilot training, we are embracing this evidence-based training. At the same time, the new concept of competence-based training is taking a lot of traction, and that is, I would say, domain agnostic. You can deploy the concepts in any domain, and that is, for me, indeed where we should go when it comes to mechanics as well. Focus more on the outcome rather than the process. Today, a bit of, I think it's prevalent in some other areas. We are focusing on how many hours, how big the books should be to learn by, in order to pass the exam. We should focus then more on, okay, what competence do I need to get at the end of the day? How we measure that competence, which is not an easy matter, especially in complex disciplines like this one, and I see them moving in the same direction like all the other professional categories in aviation.
I think the competence based or evidence based approach is good. At the same time, I think for smaller organizations, specifically in business aviation, it actually can sometimes be difficult, especially if you have to bring that knowledge to an NAA, to your national authority, who also has issues with it, and so I think we agree that it's a good approach, but it definitely needs a lot of tweaking and making sure it all stays there in the right place. If we look at engineers from your side, Ben, how big and are they already in the systems within the EBAA process? And do you, because you have the global view on it, and the US have a different approach to it, to Europe. Is it an issue there as well?
Well, sure, it is. There's going to be tremendous demand after this. I think if we thought we saw shortages before COVID, it's going to be multiples afterwards. Due to many reasons, people leaving the industry, early retirements, et cetera, all over the various sectors, which will have a dramatic or indirect relationship to what we experience in the business aviation sector. Technicians are covered in this EBAA, obviously. It's a fully integrated management system with their training and recurrent. What we've seen operators do typically is in most countries, you have the 90-day division between short-term storage and long-term storage of the aircraft, and of course the requirements from the manufacturer, et cetera, to put an aircraft in long-term storage versus having it ready in a more short-term, which happens to also coincide with the currency requirements of the crews. So, you know, I mentioned briefly the engine runs, taxi runs, touch skills, and flight. So that's one way that small operators have been able to keep the airplane ready, is coincide the limitations of the long-term storage of pilot needs with some currency flights as well in the actual aircraft. That's been quite common.
So before I'm going to ask a specific thing to Eduard at the end, I would like to go back to the session title, and I would like to ask all three of you to come with a specific thing what you would like to keep. What new ways of working do we want to keep after the crisis has ended? And I'll just keep the same order. So Stan, you're the lucky one. What out of all the things that are happening is the one thing you would like to keep?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty difficult question to answer. Just one thing, because there's so many things that I'd like to do. But I was, thinking back and sort of communicated internally with our team here. Why did we and why did so many other companies transition from the pre-COVID to the COVID world and do it quite well? And it's not an accident. It's not good luck. It's all about, being able to evolve, think of new ways of doing things continuously. And I think, and that put us and other operators in a good position to adapt to the new ways of working, to work, encourage new relationships with the regulators, with suppliers and partners to manage the risk and allow business continuity. So really what I want to see us keep doing is just keep that desire to keep evolving and improving and changing and adapting, and not sit back and say, well, we've got here and we're okay. Because if we get there, we'll die. We do need to have that learner mindset where we're willing to change and be prepared for the unexpected. None of us expected this. On January 1st, this virus was just something over in Asia that was going to disappear like SARS did. And it's turned our world upside down. And even when it hit us, I thought it'd be, like Edward said, we'd be back to normal pretty much by now. So keep evolving and keep adapting.
Well, I think you almost summed up the resilience session from yesterday nicely, and we're very pleased to have Eduard here because the EBAA is very pleased with the second part of your answer, which is you keep evolving, and the team at EASA we find has the same mindset. So we're very happy with that. But Eduard, same question to you. What would you like to keep after the crisis?
Now, it's very difficult to follow after Stan because he took all the good to make. Certainly, I fully agree with the point he's making. I've been a regulator all my life, and I believe I'm a safety professional. I think safety has to be put in context, and that is one of the something that we need to retain and reinforce. Safety doesn't exist only per se, just for the sake of being safe. Safety is a dimension of a business in the end, of an economic activity, and that I think was reinforced quite brutally, I would say, in the context of this crisis. So at the same time, I think as a regulator, we are quite fortunate to be in aviation because of the, let's say, intrinsic very low risk appetite within the business. So here we can really speak of safety partnership. I think it's okay. There are certain roles and certain expectations from the various parts of the stakeholder ecosystem, but I felt that this crisis, in its brutal fashion, brought us together, and this was remarkable in a way that we could, in the end, rally together to get out of it and to get out of it safely. You are discussing about resilience. That is perhaps the strongest point of aviation. What we do and what you do is risk management every single day. And actually, we are quite good. If you think what flying is and what the intrinsic risks are in this activity, the performance is incredible, and I would imagine that when it looks at business aviation, the safety performance is actually quite even better, I would say, compared with the rest of the sector. This pandemic brought us in front of a new risk, the epidemiological risk, we thought we knew it because this is not the first time we have a pandemic. There was SARS, there was MERS, a bit of Ebola. Okay, we managed them. There was some impact on aviation, but in the end, it got us out stronger. It turned out that we were not prepared. But at the same time, we managed to mitigate this risk. If we're looking at how aviation is performing now in terms of managing the risk to passengers and the risk to frontline personnel, and we are getting those numbers from our charter signatories, the ones that are telling us how the measures that have instituted so far are working. We see better numbers than the ones we see from the general population. So this is giving us hope and indication that actually aviation system rose to the challenge and is making, let's say, good use of the tools that we were so good at in managing this new risk. And for me, this is something that I really want to foster in the future, is to really empower and invest in the robustness and agility of our SMSs. This was the real test of fire for the SMS to really prove its worth, because all these regulatory systems that were taking care of almost everything, sometimes a bit too much, were challenged by the reality out there. So we had to reinvent, we had to invent, we had to improvise, but we had to do that safely. And that is where the SMS, in my view, has to be there to be really fluid and agile, to be able to respond to this type of changes in the risk scenarios.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I think we can echo what you're saying. And what I find interesting, I've been in both commercial aviation and business aviation, is that yes, and that's why I asked the question to Stan about the extra work that was needed for the ops departments. But business aviation is used to make an assessment for each flight of a destination, a location, etc. Now, the amount of things we need to look at has skyrocketed, but it's ingrained within the structure already. So I think we are in a nice spot. We're in a better spot because we have the ability to be flexible and we have that focus. So no, I fully agree with your assessment there, Eduard. Ben, same question to you. Once it's ended, what do you want us to keep? What do you think is the nice things you would definitely like to push forward?
Thanks for making me last after my esteemed panelists have taken the thunder there, and very well said, both Stan and Eduard. I agree completely. And what we've seen, and this will lead me to my point on what I want to take away here, is that operators by the dozens and the hundreds through this pandemic that we've worked with are focusing on the essentials, back to basics. So we already rose to the challenge as a sector. Business aviation, you know, I've already mentioned how demanding it is. We all know it. I'm preaching to the choir, and it's always humbling and for me, and makes me very proud to be associated with these professionals. But this was that challenge of a career. And there was a lot of focus. We spent a lot of time with countless operators on back to the basics of risk reduction. You know, how do I do this? How do I get this done? What's the end result of this? How about change management here? How about focus on various aspects of my SMS before? It's not just something we pull out getting ready for an audit or an inspection. Yes, we think about risk reduction second nature, but in the formal way, when there's unknowns and you don't know what you don't know, makes it very challenging. So that high level of focus on the full integrated management system of risk reduction that is in this EBAA and other SMSs, certainly, that's what I want to see continue. There was a laser beam focus, obviously, and it was very appropriately placed. So I don't want us to lose that focus and on to everything else that has been already said. And certainly on a smaller side note, we've all gotten much more comfortable with this type of communication style, and even in applications that we didn't think it was possible before, particularly assessing cultural items at an operator and the audit environment. We're much more comfortable with it. Definitely it's going to be here to stay for various applications, remote audits, difficult places, frequent base visits, things like that. More progressive audits like the progressive stage 3, and of course online workshops. You still get the ability to do this, and you save quite a bit of money, time, and effort. So there's a small, simple takeaway like that. But to me, that focus where we are now is what's gotten us through, as Edward mentioned.
Just a quick follow-up question to that then, Ben, is if we talk about remote audits, what's the one thing that you say makes it work? Because I can assume if somebody is all old-fashioned paperwork, or what are the things, the tools that an operator should have to make it easy to get a proper remote audit that not only ticks the box but gives the auditor a good feeling? Do you have any sense with that?
Well, sure. And if you'd like, on IBAC.org under resources, the policies listed there, there's a lot of lessons learned shared in there, tips of the road, if you will. But the takeaway has been a couple of things. Preparation is essential. You've got obviously IT things like my problem earlier, where sometimes it's unavoidable when you have what I had happen. But then there's also where we're going to go, what we're going to see, the layout, who you're going to see, who you're going to talk to. You're still allowed to have that randomness of inspection. And through the various conversations over the course of the audit, you're still able to assess a culture. It's not ideal. It's not our preference. We want to do the live ones and get back to that as soon as we can. But it did much better than we thought. And certainly with documentation checks and effort like that, with drop boxes and online communications prior. So the focus, there's been a lot of what would be looking at, like you said, pen and paper on a manual. In the electronic world now with EFBs, electronic manuals and searchable manuals, and how that's evolving right now, it's become much easier, and also being able to connect with more places. So before, you might have an organization with, say, 4 bases. You'd connect with 1 or 2 in sampling, of course, of those remote sites. But through this medium, now that we're more comfortable with it, that's an application that might continue. You could hit more bases. You could hit more crew randomly. The ones that can't come to the office today, we've got 3 or 4 people flying, or the chief pilots wherever. Now you can certainly reach out and touch them. We're used to this now. They can expect it. So there's been a force multiplier effect with the capabilities in auditing, in some ways positive, but certainly I'll leave it with this. In some ways negative. The being there face to face obviously can never be replaced. And it's going to be the biggest part of what we do going forward for many reasons, but this has its place as used appropriately.
So you can almost think about a dual approach whereby you do the preparation online, on the manuals, on the books, on the structure, and then the time the auditor is on site is way more specific and hopefully more efficient.
Yeah, that's been the essence of the drive. For example, the flight plan stage 1 for the small operator, they're busy. And the whole essence behind that program is to do it in a one-day audit. So with the implementation work with the specially standardized auditor that's an implementer, getting ready, the back and forth to coordinate with those manuals and the pre-validation effort, so that when that auditor shows up, that one-day audit is actually very doable. We are leveraging it where appropriate. You have remote audits, operators at Antarctica that we've had audits done, out back of Australia. There's obvious applications there too.
Okay, well, those were the questions I had, but we have some very good questions from the audience. And if you have any additional questions, this is the moment to send them in. The first question, actually, it's 2 questions with a similar field to it. So I'll just combine them. One is by an anonymous attendee and the other one by Paulo Novembre. The first one is, what operators could use a simplification and alignment of requirements and regulations? How does EASA see this process going into the future of regulation? The follow-up one, the health pandemic crisis wrecked conventional patterns of anticipate and coping with unexpected risk and perils. What will be the future roadmap of European and international bodies? So I would like to see and combine them and basically say and address this to you, Eduard. How does EASA see the process going forward in the future of regulation, and is there a roadmap you already have thought about? And I think you alluded a little bit already to it.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and thank you for the questions. Looking at our regulatory body of rules and procedures and regulations, it's quite big. The only one in ops, for example, is I think we have 2,000 pages of regulatory material, and every day we are told it's too much and too little. So coming out of this dilemma is for me the biggest challenge. And looking at why we have 2,000 pages of regulations and being too many and too little at the same time, is because our rules grew with the technology. There's a lot of technology in our rules, and the technology was quite standardized. In the end, what we have is a twin jet that is the backbone of the aviation industry. Okay, you'll have here and there a change in there's one engine more, is placed in the back, is placed under the wings, but all in all, that's what we have, and they are all operating more or less in the same fashion. There's certain nuances when it comes to on-demand versus scheduled. Now this technology evolved over time, I said, to become what it is. It is now the moment when the pace of development on the technological side is accelerating at speeds that are challenging the regulators. Simply the processes that we have cannot keep up. And this is seen as a problem. It will be a problem in the sense that we cannot reap, let's say, the efficiency benefits that technology will afford us, and at the same time also the safety benefits that would be in that technology. So our roadmap, if you want, although maybe is a bit a too pretentious word, is to start and move the technology out of the hard law part of our rules. Because for that, the process is simply, and it has to be like this, but it's too slow for us to really be able to keep up with the developments and move those areas that we allow us to be a bit more, let's say, flexible and agile in addressing those. If you look at our rules today, they only speak of aeroplanes and helicopters. We are already challenged quite a lot with some new technology out there to decide whether whatever that aircraft is one of those. And when we came to the conclusion that might not be neither nor an aeroplane and a helicopter, and those will come more and more. It's basically the third revolution. We have witnessed the jet revolution unfolding over decades. Basically now we're looking at the electrical and digital revolution merge into one, and it's basically you can witness it developing in real time. And that is, I think, the biggest challenge we have as regulators, to keep up with this change. And keeping up is also fundamental in terms of our relevance in the work that we do for the society. We need to evolve as well to ensure that the work that we do remains relevant for our, let's say, stakeholder. And when I say stakeholder, the traveling public being at the heart of that ecosystem.
That is a very interesting answer, Eduard. And I think obviously we have EBAC as a day-to-day tool, almost roadmap on the day-to-day thing. But I think what you're basically saying is that the rules and regulation needs to be almost platform agnostic. It's whatever's going to fly. And actually, I think we talked about a perfect storm in the sense that we had the B from Brexit, the C from COVID, all coming together. Oh, and then, well, it's the B from Boeing in there as well. But this is strategically also strategically, it is happening as we speak, as you rightly say, in a perfect storm, electrical, digital, and I would actually like to add the green revolution which is part of it. And so maybe the electrical might be even a solution or not, but that is very interesting. So I hope it answers the question from Paolo and the other person there. We have a question. If we stay in that field, Ben, I know you guys have been doing something already on, and we're talking about this electrical and digital things, on urban air mobility. So what are you guys doing with it? Because let's face it, EBAA is very operator focused, and I know you're getting more and more into the specialist operations, which I think is great, because that is also a part of the industry that can benefit from EBAA. But how do you deal with something like urban air mobility?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We've had several operators integrate, of course, unmanned vehicles already, multiple power companies for various purposes, special mission use there to supplement helicopters in their organization or replace them. So traditional flight departments with small unmanned, and then also working with like Uber Elevate, where this EBAA is their choice of system, and they're planning on to operate typically as an AOC, with starting with helicopters, transitioning to the electric passenger transport machines, aircraft, and into unmanned as well. So, you know, the EBAA is configured for drop-down menus for various vehicle types. We even had one that was all unmanned, traditional flight department that replaced airplane with aircraft with unmanned aircraft. So the point being is that to keep up with that, the urban air mobility working group is focused on both of those. So in short order, the unmanned special use small drone unmanned vehicles for the power company type application will be integrated. Bigger work is being done with a consensus of many industry experts working with various states and technologies and OEMs and companies like Uber and others to get involved and come together with a consensus of the standard, which will be operating very differently than how we see vehicles now. So that's being worked on, and for another effort to continue to update and stay with the times, as well as a special mission and special purpose use for current helicopter operators. And our relationship with the Helicopter Association International, HAI, we've got a revamp going on where the various special purpose, like external loads, other types of not personnel transport, VIP or tourist type, will be also drop downs or tabs as part of the EBAA checklist. So we're trying to stay up with the times with the changes with eVTOL, going with the current leaders in that sector and the users that plan to use the technology and be guided by the principles outlined in this performance-based standard.
Okay, just quickly jumping over to Stan for that as well. I know that a while ago, I know you guys were working within your company on using UAVs, etc., for over-the-horizon kind of things. How do you look at that? Is that still an active project? Is there anything exciting happening there for you?
It's very, very active. You know, we've traditionally focused a lot on helicopters and helicopter performance, helicopter safety, in the offshore space. Secondly, in fixed wing operations, supporting our activities, business activities and production activities around the world. But remotely piloted aerial systems, RPAS, as we call them, are an important part of our business. And we're doing everything from the very small, almost retail type units that you see, through to much larger systems doing remote beyond visual line of sight. The visual line of sight is a bit easier to manage, and particularly if you're operating a small vehicle within the confines of a facility. But the beyond visual line of sight, you are now operating in that public airspace, and so you have to interact with the aviation system to make it work. So it is, I mean, it is a big focus for us.
Yeah, I can imagine that within the facility it should be no issue, because if I recall well, in any Shell facility you have to wear a helmet. So that's a very practical solution to that. I have two more questions I would like to go through. One of them is an anonymous attendee asked, why not moving to evidence-based regulations instead of having 2,000 pages of requirements? Now, I can understand that we're coming from a 1940s situation, and obviously would like to move forward. So that's an interesting one for you, Eduard. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, be careful what you wish for. That would be my first reaction, because flexibility needs to be managed. I think we can make one single rule that is one page, be safe. Will that be enough? I think not. So flexibility, while we all understand its need to be able to cope with this rapidly changing environment, new sets, clusters of risk, evolving scenarios, new technology, and also not to forget the human. Aviation is a human business. Humans are at the heart of aviation. This needs to be managed, and certainly when we speak about evidence-based, performance-based, they don't need to be hollow buzzwords. They need to mean something, and we cannot manage anything if we cannot measure what we want to manage. So that is for me the challenge that we have in building us systems that will allow us flexibility but control at the same time. I can give you an example when it comes to the relationship between industry and the regulators that is very concrete. We are rolling out new rules on fuel management. Fuel management has been done for a long time. Basically, you had the recipe, you had so many fuel, so many trip fuel, taxi fuel, contingency, 30 minutes of that, 5% of that. It worked fairly well, you could say. For the regulators, in order to approve your fuel scheme would take 30 minutes. You check all these boxes and they add up. Thank you very much. Here's your operations manual back. Does it work in practice? We've seen aircraft running out of fuel for poorly managing a perfectly legal fuel reserve. Yep. And crashing with fuel starvation. And this is what we want to do now is, okay, you can still apply this way of having these very prescriptive fuel schemes, but also embrace more flexible ones where based on your data, what you're flying, your decision-making capabilities that will redirect you rather than wait for Madrid to clear up after being closed by a storm for 2 hours in the air together with other 80 aircraft that are in the same situation. This will allow you this flexibility, tank a bit less, but focus more on how you manage that fuel and how you make the decision at the right moment. But of course, in terms of managing that flexibility, the regulators are looking at this with anticipation and a bit of apprehension, because there's a new skill set required in terms of approving and overseeing such a fuel scheme. The same would be in a fully evidence performance-based environment. So in the end, I think we should be realistic and pragmatic. It will be a combination of the both. I think we certainly need to evolve from this perhaps too prescriptive approach that we have at times, with a limitation built in being prescriptive, because we are approximating reality every time we put out a new rule. And as Stan said, we need to be better prepared for unexpected, and the rules have to cater for that. But at the same time, those rules have to be implementable by the operators, by the people involved in their application on a daily basis, and can be overseen by regulators.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, and I would like to add a third component, which makes it a bit more difficult for business aviation to work sometimes with evidence-based. Evidence is based on data, and with a small fleet, it's much harder. If I'm Ryanair flying 300 737s, it's much easier to work on that and come to that. So it's a chicken and the egg, and I agree with, you know, it is what you wish for, and the 2,000 pages is too much, but finding the balance is an intriguing thing, and I think we will probably never come to a good conclusion on that, but it's definitely something to work on. I had two more things. First of all, I saw a remark by Cameron regarding training. Have any of the organization present here published the issue of recency, etc., raised by COSIT and potential cost involved, e.g. extra SIMs? For your information, Cameron, they have been raised by a number of EBAA members, and what we have is we have our own working groups, and we've raised it among others with EASA or other relevant authorities. So if you have things like that, that's what the EBAA is for. Make us aware. You run into issues, and we learned very early on that for people to get into certain countries was one of the big issues. So we looked at that. So I would like to answer it with that one if you're fine with it. We've got 4 minutes left, and I would like to just touch on two more things. One of the things I mentioned is the perfect storm, electrical, digital, as Eduard says, and I added onto it the green storm and decarbonization. Stan, if I look at you guys, your company makes a lot of money with selling fuel, and at the same time we're now moving to a society who would like to change. How do you deal with it, and what are your thoughts on decarbonization? I'm not sure if we still have Stan there. Oh, you're muted, Stan.
Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've seen in this crisis is that decarbonisation has been elevated to the forefront. It appears that there's been a lot of attention, and we see things accelerating. And there's many different approaches. There's carbon offsets, there's synthetic fuels, there's sustainable aviation fuels, there's electric, there's hydrogen. And it's completely in line with what our company is doing. Shell is committed to decarbonising the aviation sector and other sectors as well, the marine sector and others. And it is going to be part of our license to operate. We have to do something. The whole aviation industry does, and business aviation in particular. And I know I've worked with you, Robert, in the EBAA. We recognised this at least 3 years ago, looking at sustainability. We've been, and it's going to be a phased approach. We're not going to be able to go to electric aircraft to be able to fly long range to Asia tomorrow. That's going to take some time, and it might be hydrogen, it might be synthetic fuel produced from green hydrogen and carbon capture. Initially, we want to encourage people to do things such as carbon offsets, which is not a long-term solution, but it's a starting point. Then using sustainable aviation fuels, minimising their carbon footprints through minimised APU use and the smaller measures as well. And then as we evolve, as technology evolves, as the energy sources evolve, I think decarbonisation in our sector is an achievable target, very achievable.
Perfect. We're hitting about 12 o'clock, but there's one last question I think I would like to address to you, Eduard, to finish up with. We've seen an extremely interesting development at EASA regarding a European AOC. One of our members, Lux Aviation Group, has been part of it. Are the launch customer on the business aviation side, and I think Wizz Air on the commercial airline side. I think it's a great way of standardization. I think it hopefully makes things more level throughout Europe. I'm just really interested going forward. How do you see this develop going forward?
Thank you, Robert. Indeed, this is one of the the latest addition in terms of responsibilities that are entrusted to the agency, i.e. the agency may become competent authority in the domain of air operations for European operators. It's a more complex arrangement when it comes to air operations, because the air operating certificate in itself or alone is not a right to do business. You will still require an operating license that will still need to be obtained from a European state. So we use this casual name as the EASA AOC, but ultimately is an AOC that is issued on behalf of a member state. EASA not being, or EU not being a state, we don't have that concept yet. You're right. We have started with Wizz Air from Hungary. A point-to-point one fleet operator, and the next on our list of AOCs is Masterjet, the member of Luxaviation Group, which is completely different in that sense. On demand, multiple fleet, multiple AOCs around Europe. Bring its fair share of challenges, working a lot with the member states where the AOC is based, because it's part of the arrangement that we have to take in terms of transferring this responsibility from one state to the other. The question I think everybody would ask themselves is, why going to EASA, and where does it make sense? I think it makes sense, especially in the context of multiple AOCs that are scattered across Europe, especially when you have to deal with the concept of traffic rights, especially outside of the EU. Those AOCs are still required because some states do not accept to look at EU as a block and will rather deal with each state at a time. And that, of course, brings some complexity and let's say, reinforces the need of maintaining this multiple AOC. The agency can become let's say, the unifier in that context by becoming the single competent authority for those AOCs, helping indeed to standardize in terms of and streamline operations within that group. Allowing economies of scale by having a truly integrated management system for the entire ecosystem of AOCs. And of course, it has to, it will evolve as the need will evolve. And our role, as I said, we see it more and more in the context of really supporting this type of pan-European group operations, rather than replacing the member states in dealing with AOCs that are fully national in that sense.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that. And we run over just by 3 minutes, but I would like to thank all three of you for making yourself available and making this very interesting panel. The most interesting thing is, I think we talked about rules, and then as you were we pointed out earlier, they've been around since 1940, and we're still using the same rules and regulations. On training, we have the same issue. You know, we've been there since 1940 and going on. But as one of the viewers pointed out, there's a sign behind me that's been there since 1940 as well, and it's still applicable in today's market. Keep calm and carry on. So if we would like to say, what new ways of working do we want to keep after the crisis has ended? We would love to keep sessions like this, but hopefully next year we'll see you physically on site in beautiful Cologne. So with that, again, a big thank you to the panel, and thank you for everybody attending. And I give the floor back to Corina.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us today. Edward was mentioning that if we would write regulation on one page, it would be safe. Well, I'm not saying that we're writing regulation in Be Safe being the EBAA safety newsletter, but I encourage you to subscribe because we have lots of interesting things on safety development. Now we reached the time for our lunch break, so I would like to thank you very much for staying with us until now. And I would invite you to join us after the lunch.